Hi, everyone, and welcome back to China in the News. I'm Christine. Today, we're going to explore an incredible story with Doug Guthrie, who was referred to as a China whisperer in journalist Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China. Doug's expertise has been instrumental in helping Apple navigate the complex and often challenging political and business environment in China. And if you're interested in how one of the world's biggest tech company manages China's strategy, you're going to want to hear this. Before we dive in, please take a moment to like this episode, share with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Doug, you were described as a China whisperer in chapter 28 of Patrick McGee's book, Apple in China. That's quite a title. How did you become a China scholar in the first place? What drew you to this field?
Well, thank you for talking with me about this, Christine, and thanks for the question. This has been a lifelong journey. If you would have asked me when I was 18 years old if I was going to be a China scholar, I would have looked at you strangely and maybe even laughed. I was going to go to the University of Chicago, study economics, and get a job working for McKinsey and become a politician, which is what my mom wanted me to do. But I had a Taiwanese roommate, Leo Xu, and he was a dear friend from high school, but I was his roommate in college, and we were roommates throughout all 4 years. And he was one of my closest friends. And his dad is a famous China scholar, Zhou Yunxu. And Leo would play games with me and help me think about Chinese and listen to me repeating Chinese sounds and tones to him. And, as we were registering for classes in the spring of our freshman year, we had to take a language requirement at Chicago. And I was just going to take German because that's what I took in high school and it seemed like the easiest thing to do. And Lee was like, Doug, I've talked to my dad. You got to study Chinese. China is the future. And you're pretty good at listening. Your tones are pretty good. And so, and then he did the thing that you do with 19-year-olds. When I said, no, I'm just going to take German, he said, you're afraid. He dared me. And so I said, I am not. I'm going to do this. And so next thing I know, I was studying Chinese. And Christine, I fell in love. I fell in love with the language. I fell in love with the literature and history. And this was a time when I was just falling in love with the language and loving the tonal nature of the language. And it worked for my audiographic memory. And it was just beautiful. But it was also that spring that the Tiananmen movement broke out. And so here I was immersing myself in this place in the world that I had no idea about before coming to Chicago and learning this immaculate, beautiful language that I was falling in love with. And I was watching 20-year-olds stare down tanks in Tiananmen Square. And I was just so moved. And so I was like, I gotta go. I gotta go to China. And so at that time, I decided to take a year leave of absence from Chicago and just study abroad. I was going to go to Beida. And that was the plan. And I borrowed some money from my grandparents and took a leave of absence from Chicago. And I was planning on going there. But then when the June 4th happened, I couldn't go to Beijing. And so I ended up in Taiwan and I spent the year in Taiwan. And Christine, I just fell in love that year. I fell in love with the language, literature, history. And, I mean, you're from Taiwan. And so you know sort of where I was. And I was doing amazing things because I was just studying language. But I was also training with the Taiwanese national cycling team. And it was such a gift. And I came back and I realized I can't just go work for McKinsey. I got to be a China scholar. And so I shifted my major. I became a minor in economics, but my major became Chinese language and history. I studied with people like Edward Shaughnessy and Gregory Lee. And Gregory Lee was this amazing modern Chinese poet scholar who was studying people like Beidao. And, they were studying like political movements in China through poetry. And I was just like, this is amazing. Like, what's happening here? And so I spent all of my time studying language, literature, and history and minoring in economics. But when I was finishing Chicago, I realized I was still so captivated by what had happened in June 4th. And so I realized I had to study the economy and politics, but I didn't just want to be an economist. And so I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and had the amazing leadership of the China scholar Thomas Gold and also the economic sociologist Neil Flickstein. And so I spent my next 5 years studying Chinese economic sociology and political change. I spent the year of 1994, 95 in China doing doctoral research that was, data gathering, a mixture of sort of anthropology and sociology and economics. And I built a data set that nobody had ever had before. And it got a lot of recognition, and I became a young professor at New York University. I was invited at that time by Senator Paul Wellstone to be an advocate for helping China get into the World Trade Organization, which again just sort of captivated my life and my history. And just from there, that's been my life for the last 35 years, Christine, is I've just been a China scholar, and I've been watching very closely and helping the world understand this immaculate nation, but also just in love with the culture and history and the complexity of the economic relationships. And so it's been a journey and a gift.
I've heard you speak Chinese. You handle the four tones perfectly, which is unusual. My kids who are half Chinese can't even really do that. So that was amazing.
That
What
means a lot
brought
to me.
you?
Thank you, Christine.
Well, you were my instructor for Apple University in for the class Apple in China. So what brought you to Apple, and how did your expertise align with what Apple needed exactly at that time?
Well, so it's a great question. And again, so I gave you a little bit of the story. I just became a China scholar in the 1990s, and I sort of fell in love with the language, literature, and history, but also was so ensconced in the study of the economic transformation, but also then somebody who was, as a young scholar and a young professor, fought to get China into the World Trade Organization. And during that time, I continued to be a China scholar and was a professor of management and leadership at the NYU Stern School of Business and did a lot of executive education, but continued my China research. And eventually, I became the dean of the business school at the George Washington University, which was sort of an amazing gift in both the positioning and timeliness. So this was 2010 to 2013. And so there I am in Washington, D.C., as China has been, in the World Trade Organization for the last 12 years. And, it was sort of an amazing, a tense, increasingly tense time for China, but we were also all so deeply embedded in, how do we continue to build these partnerships with China? And then I ended up leaving my job as the dean of the business school at George Washington. And, I was amazed because I got a call from this person who became my boss, Joel Podolny. Joel is just an amazing scholar of leadership and somebody who had tried to recruit me at Harvard. And then I talked to him a lot when he was the dean at the Yale School of Management, and he was definitely a mentor for me. And then they watched as I made my transition out of George Washington. And, he and Tim Cook called and they said, why don't you, we're at a really interesting time. Why don't you come be with us? And this was a really interesting and critical time for Apple. And I don't know that they totally understood it at the time, but this is one of the moments that I always like to cite. So Xi Jinping was inaugurated on March 14th, 2013. March 15th of every year is something called Consumer Day, and the Chinese government always calls out some foreign company to get their attention and say, "Hey, we need you to be better." And March 15th, 2013, 24 hours after Xi Jinping was inaugurated, Apple was called out. Now, at the time, it was over warranty issues, and at the time, I don't think they thought it was that big of a deal. But, these are very smart people. And so, it got Apple's attention. And so they thought maybe, Joel Podolny was the founder under Steve Jobs, when Steve Jobs was still the leader there, was the founder of Apple University in the world. And, they needed a presence in China. And so they thought maybe we should get Doug Guthrie. He just stepped down from being the dean at George Washington University, and let's bring him. And so we went through some conversations, and eventually I joined Apple University in China. And my job was to do leadership development and training, but because I was a China scholar, it was also a good time for me to actually help them figure out what was happening under Xi Jinping.
It was amazing because I know Steve Jobs personally recruited Podolny to create and head up Apple University, and you were personally recruited by Podolny. So, yeah, 2 degrees of separation from Steve Jobs, the great Steve Jobs.
Right.
Yeah.
And the great Joel Podolny. I think the world of Joel, and I think he's a brilliant, brilliant leader. And so, Steve Jobs going through what he went through from 1984 to, being fired from 1976 to being fired from his own company in 1994 and coming back to the company in 1997, he realized he needed to be more thoughtful about how to be a leader and build an organizational culture and build an organization that was very deeply analytical about geopolitics and such. And so, in 2008, I think it was, he went out and recruited Joel Podolny and, had him found Apple University. And so by the time Joel called me, Apple University had already sort of been up and running for about 5 years, but then I was a part of that process, and it was an amazing thing to see the leadership of Steve Jobs, Joel Podolny, and Tim Cook. It was really amazing.
Well, you were definitely instrumental in helping Apple navigate the most difficult part is you mentioned the consumer day. It really started with Xi Jinping taking over. It's a time of significant shift in China's political and business landscape. So can you share a little bit exactly what you did and some of the key challenges you helped Apple overcome?
Sure. So here again, one of my core functions was to do leadership development and leadership training, and that's where I met you during that time. But it was also to be sort of the on the ground China scholar and to be thinking through what was going on. And at the time, I can tell you, Christine, I'm a heavy watcher of Chinese politics, and I was nervous. And there was a time in my early days there that the leadership of Apple was like, "Calm down, Doug. It's okay. The 2013 Consumer Day was just it was a warranty issue. We've paid the fines. We're fine." But I suspected, as somebody who's been watching Chinese society and Chinese geopolitics for the last 30 years, we all knew that Xi Jinping was going to bring something different. Like Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were very, very sort of laissez-faire, let the market decide. And that was the era that Tim Cook brought Apple into China. Xi Jinping wanted something different. So remember, one of the key things is that when China entered the WTO, it became illegal for companies to have a quid pro quo for market access. But the quid pro quo for market access was what made China so powerful as a manufacturing supply chain and as a technology. I mean, Patrick McGee writes about this in his book. What made China so powerful and it wasn't just Apple. It was the fact that in the 80s and 90s, and in particular the 90s under Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin, China said, look, if you want to be in China and you want access to our consumer markets, but you want access to our growing manufacturing supply chain, you have to give us technology. We want joint ventures. We want technology transfer. We want all of that stuff. And China became very powerful under that model, especially during the 1990s. So when China enters the WTO in 2001, it becomes illegal by WTO standards to have a quid pro quo for market access. And so suddenly Tim Cook takes Apple into China and, like you can do whatever. You can have like just access to the manufacturing supply chain, and China can't demand that you're going to give technology or give tacit knowledge. So when Xi Jinping comes to power, we were all sort of expecting, though we thought it was going to be Bo Xilai, we didn't expect how powerful or how aggressive Xi Jinping was going to be. So Consumer Day, in my opinion, was just the first signal. It was the first shot across the bow. And at the time, people at Apple were like, Doug, shh, calm down, Mr. China. It's okay. We're going to be okay. And then in 2014, there was a CSR report that ranked all companies, foreign companies operating in China. And, there was Samsung and Intel and a bunch of other companies, and Apple was way, way low. I mean, it was a horrible ranking. And it was surprising to the Apple leadership because they were like, well, we do more than anybody on issues like environmental sustainability and, labor issues. And how are we so low? And again, my answer to them was, this is just a signal. They want something from you. And so then still we were sort of, you know, just dancing around the issue. But in 2015, when China changed the labor dispatch law, this is what I had been predicting. And this was the real shot across the bow because the labor dispatch law, so labor dispatch system is really immaculate in China because there is a set of labor laws, and all corporations working in China, both Chinese organizations, but also foreign organizations, they have to follow the Chinese labor laws, which are much more aggressive than they were in, 1979 and in the decade of the 1980s. And this is what we thought was so important about China being the WTO is that the more foreign investment they had, the more they'd follow labor laws and they'd build labor laws. And they had a 1994 labor law, which was a very powerful law that protected human rights and labor. The problem was that there were loopholes in the labor law, which allowed for the migrant labor force, what they call the labor dispatch system. So 350 million migrant laborers from the poorest parts of China would sort of migrate around the country and be seasonal labor. for companies that needed it. So if you think about Apple and iPhones, you have general production, Foxconn Zhengzhou maybe has 2 to 400,000 employees over the course of a year. But for 2 months out of the year, when there's an iPhone launch, they need about 1.2 or 1.4 million employees just for those 2 months, though, right? And so, like, the economics of the situation is if Foxconn Zhengzhou has to have those people on all 1.2 million of them on labor contracts for an entire year, the economics are much different than if they have to just have 400,000 people on labor contracts over the course of the year, and then a spike in labor production that's temporary labor. And so the labor dispatch law changed that. It basically said, if there is more than 30 days of employment by anybody, they have to be on full-time labor contracts. And it was a very, very deft wording of the law because they knew things like iPhone spikes in production always were more than 30 days, right? And so,
Was
like,
it targeting Apple, or was it in general they were targeting high tech
they were
manufacturing?
targeting high tech, but
Okay.
Apple was a big part of this, and Apple was one of the big companies that didn't do joint ventures, and so they wanted to make it clear, like, we got your attention, like, you need to actually your entire economic system is going to erode under this approach to doing things. And I remember calls that I would get from people in Cupertino, Christine, and they would be lawyers, and they'd be like, Doug, what does this mean? We can't our suppliers can't comply with these laws. And I would say, thinking I was being very obvious, but it was, I think to lawyers' ears, it was strange. I would say, that's the point. You're supposed to be out of compliance. And they would say, what does that mean? Why would they pass a law where we're supposed to be out of compliance? And I said, well, because compliance only depends on whether the local governments are citing you for noncompliance. And then they would say, well, what does that mean? And I would say, well, what it means is the quid pro quo for market access is that China must demand something from you in order for you to operate there. But if you offer something to them, they're not violating the quid pro quo for market access because you offered it. They didn't demand it,
That's
right? So,
brilliant.
so what you need to figure out is what does the mayor of Zhengzhou want? What does the mayor of Shenzhen want? What does the governor of Guizhou want? And so if you offer it to them, it's not a violation of WTO rules. And so this was sort of the education that I was doing with them as I was trying to get them to understand, like, you have
But
to.
it's so subtle, it's unspoken.
Of course, because the Chinese government can't. But this is why I don't know if this is why Patrick called me the China Whisperer, but this is why I was sort of viewed as the China Whisperer, is because my whole point was, of course, they're not going to tell you what you want, but you need to use your networks, our networks, to figure out what they want, right? So what does Chen Ming-er want? Guizhou is a very poor province. So, and they're, mostly rural agricultural labor. Probably what he wants is data centers. Let's go find that out. Right. And so eventually we did some research and talked to people, and we found out that Chen Ming-er would love data centers in Guizhou. And we were targeting Guizhou and Chen Ming-er because I thought Chen Ming-er was going to be Xi Jinping's successor. And so that was sort of a big moment, but it turned out that just didn't play out that way. But again, like, this is all about figuring out what the local governments wants. So they're not violating WTO rules, but you're just offering a gift, right? And so that's what happened. So that was the key first thing. The second thing um, was that there's a very interesting distinction, Christine, in terms of how money is counted in China. And so if you're spending money on labor, it's just labor costs, right? And Apple was spending $55 billion a year on labor. But the thing that amazed me was that Apple was also embedding their operations managers in their Chinese suppliers to teach them how to be really effective, right? In effect, what to
Is
use
that unusual for Apple, or is that unusual for
not
other
not
tech sectors?
Not unusual for Apple, but Apple does it in a bigger way and more effectively than any company I've ever seen. And I've advised a lot of tech companies over the years. Apple was doing it better and more aggressively. So here's my favorite Apple statistic, which I've quoted you before. Apple has about 25% of the smartphone market share in the world, but they take about 80% of the profits. How's that possible? And it's because their Chinese suppliers are willing to work with them for very low margins, 1 or 2%, because it's so useful for them to have Apple ops managers embedded in their firms while they're doing a market production piece on some iPhone component spike. And then they'll turn around and go make their money from Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, Samsung, and everybody else, right? And so the key thing is this is Tim Cook's brilliance, right? Like you have, you know, ID and PD in Cupertino, but you have MD in China, right? You have
Wait,
all
hold
of
on. ID is industrial design, PD is product
product
design. What's
design,
MD?
manufacturing design,
Got it.
right? And so like this is the thing that's amazing about Apple is that Tim Cook had the foresight to, when he took Apple into China, to build the manufacturing supply chain team out there as the strongest, right? So you can have ID and PD and Cupertino, but what you want are the experts in manufacturing design and manufacturing supply chain management to just be out there helping their suppliers. And it became such a valuable thing. And so here's the key thing that we convinced the Chinese government of. There's labor costs, and Apple was spending 55 billion a year in labor, and that was sort of a straight number. But they were also spending so much time passing what we call in the management literature tacit knowledge over to their Chinese suppliers that their Chinese suppliers were willing to work for them for zero margins or 1 or 2% margins. And so we convinced the Chinese government that this tacit knowledge means that we're the one company in the world that should have not our labor costs being counted as labor costs, but having them be counted as fixed asset investment. And so this was a big thing that happened in China. And it's, Wayne Ma reported on this a couple of years ago. So the numbers are out there and they're in Patrick McGee's book. So I'm not revealing anything that's not known. But the idea that we got the Chinese government to count 55 billion in labor costs as fixed asset investment it had never happened before. Like this was unprecedented. And it created a deal. And we promised a 5-year deal. And so for the next 5 years from when we signed that deal in about 2017, I think, we were committing to $275 billion invested in China in fixed asset investment, even though it wasn't technically fixed asset investment, it was labor costs, but we had gotten the Chinese government to agree that the way we were spending money on labor because we were embedding ops managers in the supply chain, that this was fixed asset investment. So it was a
I'm
really,
curious whether other companies in US companies took this as a model. Has
so
this become a template for other US enterprises?
So I don't know the answer to that because these are very, very secretive and in behind the scenes types of negotiations. But when I was there with Apple in China, this was also the time that Tesla was negotiating its deal, and Tesla got a very special deal in China. China, the automobile industry after the WTO, it was the one industry that had an exception in which you didn't have to have you had to have a joint venture in order to enter China, right? So like basically China sort of gave up on the idea like if you want to enter China in heavy industry or manufacturing or electronics, you had to have a joint venture and you had to transfer technology. The one sector that they didn't give that up on was automobiles, and they had reasons for it because automobiles have safety issues, automobiles have pollution issues, et cetera, et cetera. Tesla was the first automobiles company since China's entry into the WTO that didn't have a joint venture. So they had a wholly owned foreign enterprise, but it was directly under the Shanghai municipal government. So that gigafactory was, sort of a core plum for the Shanghai municipal government. But and, again, I wasn't part of the negotiations, but watching the way Tesla was embedded there and the ways they worked with suppliers similar to the way Apple worked with suppliers, I'm sure, Elon Musk is a smart guy and he probably knows Tim Cook pretty well. And I'm sure that they were watching very closely. And so I think Patrick McGee makes this point, and I think he even said it on the interview that you and I did with him. If you look at BYD, they were an okay company, and
They
they
were a battery company. They
yeah,
started out.
and
They
and
weren't even EV.
yeah, and they'd been there, for 15 years before Tesla got there. But suddenly, once Tesla was there and training the suppliers of their manufacturing supply chain, because Tesla's not wholly vertically integrated, they're relying on a lot of Chinese suppliers. Those same suppliers are supplying BYD. And so, like, my guess is that the diffusion of knowledge of how Apple was operating diffused across industries. I don't know that
So
for certain, but I'm
the
pretty
formula of tacit knowledge is now sort of a template in how to work around joint venture.
for high tech firms. I mean, it doesn't help
Yes.
with organizations like Walmart because if you're doing light industry goods, it doesn't mean anything. But yes, for high tech firms where China wants access to the knowledge of how to do efficient manufacturing supplying in the manufacturing supply chain, yeah, the model Apple forged the path of investment in labor with suppliers and the training of the managers of the manufacturing supply chain was tacit knowledge that could be counted as fixed asset investment. Yes.
I know you ended up spending quite a number of years in Shanghai, actually on the ground in China. So, how did you help Apple kind of maintain or cultivate the close relationship with the Chinese government?
Well, it's a great question, Christine. And here's the thing that again, I mean, this is probably true in all markets. So I think if we think about, markets in America as arm's length, things like there's a whole field in economic sociology that talks about like markets are social networks. And, I think you had Brian Uzi at when you got your degree at Kellogg. Like, there are lots of people who have studied this. But for China scholars, it is especially important to think about the networks of markets and the implicit and tacit knowledge of how to analyze things in markets. And so, again, I don't know if this is the reason, but I think the reason people started calling me the China Whisperer is I had a lot of connections. I knew a lot of people. I knew people in the Shanghai government. I knew people in the Zhengzhou government. I knew people all around. And I knew people who came over to advise Xi Jinping and kind of returned to China in that space. And so I just think it's really important to realize in a place like China, a complex manufacturing supply chain, but also a complex geopolitical economy and a complex cultural economy, Guanxi matters. Like you know the term Guanxi, so, but for our
Yeah.
listeners who don't know the term Guanxi, Guanxi means social relations, right? Mayfair Yang wrote a beautiful book called The Art of Social Relations in China. And, hers was sort of the breakthrough book, but, it was really about this idea like, you know, social capital and networking matters and who matters. And those people influencing the government matters. And so I just really pushed, the people that were working in China from the leadership, but especially the Gang of Eight, that we couldn't just be efficient manufacturing supply chain managers. We had to build the art of relationships a la Mayfair Young. And we did. We worked on that.
Eh, Do you think Guanxi is particularly necessary in Chinese environment versus Western business environment?
Well, so old school China scholars would argue, of course, Guanxi is critical. I mean, when I was advising companies in the 1990s, we echoed Mayfair Yang's work all the time and said, like, you have to understand Guanxi and you have to understand the art of social relationships, et cetera, et cetera. I did write an article, I think it was in the 1999 in the China Quarterly, and it got me a lot of flack in the China field because I wrote this article called The Declining Significance of Guanxi in China. And a lot of people in the China field were really upset about this. They're like, Doug, what have you've studied too much economics? And I was like, no, no, no. We all understand, that social relationships matter in China, but it's not as crazy as some scholars, like the anthropologists like Mayfair Young, have argued. And it is declining because people care about the transactional issues, right? They care about Apple delivering, you know, really good tacit knowledge, and they care about paying for that knowledge in the marketplace. And there's a whole economic sociology literature that says that social relationships matter in all economies, including the United States, right? And so transactional economies always depend on social relationships also. Now, that being said, Guanxi still matters in China. And if you want to like influence the Chinese government, you better know some people at high levels who can tell you what the local Chinese governments are wanting or what people like President Xi are looking for. So it matters. But I've just argued that it probably matters a little less than the anthropologists have thought.
That makes sense. Well, given the current difficult relations with the Trump administration and ongoing geopolitical tension, how do you think Apple should approach its China strategy moving forward? What solutions or path out of this dilemma would you suggest to Tim Cook based on your experience?
Yeah. So it's a great question, Christine. And my strong issue, as you know, is I'm really interested in getting us away from state to state, China, Beijing to Washington type negotiations. Um, at least in the case of China, China has set up a very, very powerful capitalist economy. And, I've gotten in some trouble because I've said that China's capitalist economy is better than the United States right now. And people are like, well, how can you say that? A communist authoritarian economy? But yes, China is organized out of Beijing, but Beijing has set in motion this thing which my favorite China scholar in the world, Andy Walter, called local governments as industrial firms. And so it's this very, very diverse set of issues where local governments are responsible for meeting GDP predictions and they're responsible for meeting them in their core industrial clusters and they're responsible for being innovative and taking them in this direction. And so, in my opinion, to answer your question, so on the one hand, I think people like Tim Cook, they need to negotiate with people like Donald Trump, and they need to negotiate with people like Xi Jinping. And yes, for major, major corporations, that matters. But where the action really matters is at local government levels, right? And that's really where I think things are most interesting. Whereas what's happening with Apple and many other companies that have been successful in China. Tesla's a little bit of an outlier because Shanghai is such a major player in the Shanghai Gigafactory, and Shanghai is one of the four municipal provincial level governments in China. But where things really matter are in the hidden gems of China, right? The Zhengzhou government, the Shenyang government, the Dalian government, like the Chuzhou government. Like these are the places where local industrial clusters become very, very powerful. And the extent to which those local governments become very wedded to companies like Apple, they will defend Apple. They will make the case that, we have to have this relationship. And that is one of the things that gave us leverage when we were negotiating with the central government is we weren't just knocking on Beijing's door. We were knocking on the doors of all the local governments that we were working with, and we had them as our advocates. And so, there's really interesting things happening right now in China. Xi Jinping and the Beijing government are incentivizing local governments to not just be local industrial clusters, but to be thought leaders. So recently, I got a call from the Liaoning province government because they're thinking of setting up a new think tank, and they want some foreigners who are thoughtful about foreign trade in Liaoning government. And Shenyang is one of my case study cities. And so we've thought a lot about how to do this kind of work because Shenyang is a fascinating city and Liaoning province is a fascinating provincial level government. And so if I was advising Tim Cook still, I would be saying, focus local, dude. Focus local. Of course, you got to defend your position with Donald Trump and you got to be good with Beijing, but just be deeply embedded in these local governments because once you're inextricably intertwined with the local governments, they will defend you to the end. And so that's where when when corporations call me and ask what they should do, I'm always like local, 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 be local. And so I think that's the model for
I
me.
remember you talked about the BMW. Can you kind of share with our audience about the BMW in Shenyang?
Yeah, I mean, so Liaoning province, for those, again, like if you're somebody who watches China and you've been watching for a while, of course, places like, you know, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, the major places. But fewer people know Liaoning province. Now, if you are somebody who's thought about trade, I was raising this with my dean recently and talking to her about the Liaoning province think tank, and she was like, "Oh my goodness, yeah, years ago I wrote a case study on Dalian." Right? Because Liaoning is a fascinating province because a lot of people know about Dalian because it's an import city on the east coast of China, right? It's very near Japan and like, if you wanted to think about like getting into China but not going through the Shanghai ports, go to Dalian, right? And so it was known as an import province. But Dalian is over on the east coast and Shenyang is more in the center to the west coast of Liaoning. And Shenyang is an old industrial city, right? And it has a lot of industrial machinery. The Shenyang Machine Tools Factory is an amazing, amazing old school manufacturing hub. But they were gifted some years ago because when BMW was trying to figure out where to be in China, they decided, yeah, we don't want to just be in Shanghai or in Zhejiang. We want to be in a place that has an old industrial center and is a smaller province and a smaller city that we can really kind of have close relationships with. So they ended up in Shenyang. And so Liaoning has this fascinating dynamic where it's got a huge import city in Dalian, and now Shenyang is one of the really powerful old school industrial manufacturing supply chain cities. And so, yeah, I love that story. I think Shenyang and Dalian and Liaoning province are amazing as stories. And again, these are places not a lot of people know about in China, but in my opinion, they sort of tell you the story that's really going on and what's amazing in the manufacturing supply chain and the import economy in China.
Is Shenyang a tier one city?
Yeah, because it's the capital of Liaoning province, right? And so, if you sort of rank the provinces in terms of GDP, Liaoning's sort of in the middle, but Shenyang is the capital. And so I think it has to be counted as a tier one city. And I'm sure if I went back and looked at the statistics on it, it would be counted as a tier one city because you can't be a provincial capital. But it's smaller. It's very small in comparison to a lot of the big cities, but it's really important. Um,
So you talked a lot about like city to city, state to state, or province to province. So how should US or Western countries navigate when they need to operate in China?
So I would argue a very similar answer to what I just gave you about China, and about Apple in China. So let me take an example of the city that I spend a lot of time in, Phoenix, right? So I'm there because of Arizona State University and the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and I think, ASU is worthy. It's the worthy title that it's earned of the most innovative university in America. And the Thunderbird School of Global Management is number one in the world in global trade. And so we think a lot about all of these issues. But the state of Arizona, I mean, if you go back 30 years, I mean, this was a place that was a desert, I mean, it was fine and but like, what were they going to be economically? And with the growth of Arizona State University and the rise of the engineering school there and the leadership of Michael Crow, they've really become a kind of cornerstone of how to think very aggressively about economic development, and not just high-end economic development in terms of like having a top engineering, manufacturing, business school, management school, but also in terms of vocational technical education. And this was one of the leadership moments under Michael Crow, is he decided like, you don't have to be just rise in the rankings by being exclusive. You can actually let a lot of people in, 80% of the people who apply, but you can have high-end study, but also vocational technical education. And if we're going to build a manufacturing supply chain in this desert, we need those people, right? And so the Fulton School of Engineering is like one of the key reasons, as I have understood the reports, that TSMC decided to bite on the CHIPS Act under Biden, 6.5 billion in investment, and say, okay, we're going to invest in the state of Arizona. But following that 6.5 billion investment and the partnership with the city of Phoenix and Arizona State University, TSMC has already invested $65 billion in the state of Arizona in building the manufacturing supply chain for the three fab sites, but they've also committed to investing another 100 billion. So think about that, right? The city of Phoenix and the state of Arizona have now transformed the economics of that state by partnering with TSMC. And my argument for Kate Gallego and Neil Giuliano, who's the president of Greater Phoenix Leadership, and others, is let's go after Chinese investment. Let's go after Chinese investors at the city to city level. So what's the sister city of Tempe? Zhenjiang. What's the sister city of Phoenix? Chengdu. Let's go find the factories that want to build on these city to city relationships. Or, we don't have sister city relationships or sister state relationships with provinces and states, but like I would argue if Kate Gallego was listening to me, like we should go sit down with the governor of Liaoning province and start to think about, getting Shenyang machine tool factories in the state of Arizona and build those kinds of relationships. And here again, Christine, like once our state to state and city to city relationships are so deep, we can't have trade wars. We can't have tariffs. Like our economies are already married because of Apple and Tesla and Walmart's embeddedness in China. But like, let's do it at the city to city and state to state relation. So that's my advice.
I love this because Sister City used to be more cultural and
Yeah,
educational exchanges, and you're basically proposing industrial and manufacturing
beautiful.
exchanges. That's
Beautiful.
fascinating.
That's a great insight. And yes, you sort of put the lines around exactly what I'm saying is you're exactly right. Like Sister City programs were set up under the State Department to sort of be cultural exchanges. But you're exactly right, and you said it better than I did. What I'm arguing is, yeah, cultural exchanges are great, but let's do local economic relationships as well. Let's get our economies married at the local levels. And, that way we're going to be walking down this road together and it's going to be mutual beneficial for both countries and all of the cities in our two countries. And so that's my argument.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. If you found the conversation with Doug, the China Whisperer, insightful, please hit the like button and share this episode with anyone interested in US China relations. And don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date to our weekly discussions. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed. Thank you.
Thanks for talking to me, Christine. And as you can tell, I'm very passionate about these issues, and I just would love for our listeners to and followers to be passionate about them too. So thank you all, and thank you for the conversation.